Hello, and welcome to the Road to Autonomy Podcast. I am your host, Grayson Brulte. The Road to Autonomy Podcast is brought to you in part by Florida Internet and Television. It's time to cut the tax on tech. Hello, and welcome to the Road to Autonomy. I'm your host, Grayson Brulte. On today's podcast, we're absolutely honored to have John Rossant, CEO of Commotion and chairman of the NewCities Foundation. Welcome to the podcast, John.
Hey, thanks a lot, Grayson. Really good to be here.
Yeah, this is awesome. We're friends, and I'm looking forward to having a really interesting conversation. So thank you so much for taking the time.
Sure.
You started your career in Europe as the Europe Editor for BusinessWeek. Did this experience impact the way you look at mobility today?
Yeah, definitely. Because, I was based in Paris, which is a great city. And when you're based in a place like Paris, you have amazing public transit system. I mean, it's just off the charts good. The metro system, the bus, the way the city's organized. You can, walk places. It's a city that pioneered bike sharing, after all, with the Velib program. It pioneered electric car sharing with the Autolib program. So I think that certainly influenced me. As an American, I often wish our cities in America were a little bit more like European cities in the sense of walkability, the variety of mobility options that you have in Europe that we don't necessarily have here. But sure, it did influence me.
Do you think it's a cultural difference, why they have better public transit, why they're more walkable? Is it just something in their culture from generation to generation?
Look, I think it's European societies in general are, the state, the government plays a bigger role in the sort of organization of daily life than it does in the United States. So we tend to be, to use a stereotype, we're rugged individualists here in the United States. And I think that is reflected in the car culture that we have here that, the Europeans don't necessarily have. I did grow up in New York, which, in a way is organized like a European city more than it is like a city on the West Coast, for example, or in the Midwest.
New York has the incredible subway. You can get anywhere around town, and it's just extremely efficient.
Yeah, and it's not only efficient, but everyone uses it. I think as everyone uses the metro in Paris. And in fact, both in New York and in Paris, it's much more efficient to go from point A to point B in the metro or the subway than in an Uber or a car. And it's a tenth of the price, and you get there in sort of half the time. So what's not to like? So you have in both cities, in a subway car or a metro car, you have 1%ers on down. So it's a wonderful mix that sort of is an accurate reflection of sort of the population mix. Here in LA, where I'm based now, in a lot of other American cities, it tends to be more disadvantaged members of society who use public transit, which is unfortunate, I think.
Well, it's also a car culture, and the subways is ingrained into New York. So that opens up the really interesting cultural debate about the way that you've grown up and the way that you've experienced mobility. And as we go forward in society, it'll be really interesting as a child born, say, 10 years from now, what forms of mobility they experience and how that will impact and change their lifestyle. So it'll be really interesting to watch.
Yeah, definitely.
And let's go back to Paris here for a minute. You're living and working in Paris. You're doing really cool stuff at BusinessWeek. And then all of a sudden you jump to Publicis. And you start producing the World Economic Forum in Davos. Can you talk about this journey? Because it's one heck of a fancy, interesting journey.
Sure. Well, I had been a journalist I had been at BusinessWeek for almost 20 years. So it was a career. And I think going back about 15 years ago, I began to see the writing on the wall for the print press, that it was going to be just an ineluctable, steady decline. And as the Europe editor, I was starting to, the job was just becoming much less fun. I was having to lay off people and close down bureaus and stuff like that. So it just wasn't fun. And I wanted to change, and particularly wanted to move into business and the private sector, which just really, really interested me. And then the CEO and chairman of Publicis Groupe, which is one of the world's big communication companies, Saatchi & Saatchi and Leo Burnett, et cetera, 60,000 people. The chairman, based in Paris, and the chairman was a someone I knew, and he called me up one day and said, come on over for, after work, we'll have a little chat, etc. And he offered me a job, and I, after a few months of negotiation, I made the jump, and it was extraordinary because when you're a journalist, you don't think about bottom lines. It's not like being in the private sector. You're a journalist. It's the fourth estate. And when you move over to a company, it's so different. And it took me a while to get used to it. I mean, the first month or two, I would take a legal pad and I would sort of go around Paris and also around the world interviewing the top people in the company, like the head of Saatchi & Saatchi, the head of Leo Burnett. What keeps you up at night? Because I was head of public affairs and communication for the group. And I remember sitting with, I think, the chief counsel in Paris, saying, "What keeps you up at night, Russell?" And he said, "Well, we overcharged a big U.S. government agency by about $300 million, so we're trying to figure out how to." And I was thinking, he should not tell me that. And then I realized, no, he should tell me that because I need to know that. So, finally I got the hang of it. It was fascinating. And then after about 2 years, I was getting kind of bored with being a corporate suit. I was thinking of leaving, actually. And I went to the chairman. I said, probably like to move on. And he said, no, we have something in mind for you. And he made me executive chairman of a big subsidiary in Switzerland called Publicis Live, whose main activity is producing the World Economic Forum in Davos and all of the World Economic Forum events. So that was fun. So I did that for about 5 years and had a ball. It was very complicated because Davos is, this big event at the end of January every year in the small Swiss ski town in the Alps. And it attracts about 4,000 muckety-mucks around the world. I mean, from prime ministers and presidents and dictators and CEOs and thinkers. And putting that all together it's like putting a man on the moon in terms of complexity. But it was extraordinary. It was a great experience.
Is the complexity around the personalities and the egos? I mean, was that one of the hardest things when you're producing this event, of just dealing with the human factor?
I would say there's actually a logistical challenge of just kind of organizing 600 different meetings over 5 days and workshops and plenary sessions and getting, Chancellor Merkel to the right place at the right time. But you're right. The egos are amazing because it is the planet's biggest egos who go there. And what's funny is there are really only maybe 2 or 3 5-star hotels in Davos, which can't possibly service everybody who comes there. I mean, there are a lot of 3-star and 2-star and 1-star hotels. So it's very funny because these sort of 2 months prior to Davos, every year I was suddenly had, thousands of best friends. I won't reveal any names, but I mean, you would be astonished. Let's put it that way. I mean, just, "Oh, John, how are you? How are you? It's great. How's the family? Could you possibly get me into a suite at the Intercontinental?" Okay, we'll try. And that was tough, kind of negotiating all of that. It was fun.
With a lack of housing, and it's still well known to this day, the lack of housing in Davos, why was Davos initially chosen as a site? Was it due to security, or what was the driving factor?
It was Professor Klaus Schwab, who is the German professor of management who founded the World Economic Forum in 1971 as I think the European Management Forum was the first name. He actually just had a chalet in Davos. And the thing started because he would invite a few CEOs and public officials to his chalet for kind of off-the-record chats about one thing or another. And then that got formalized. I think there are 2 reasons why I think Davos grew into something big and earth-shattering, and that's because it's in Switzerland. Switzerland's neutral, and so you could have Palestinians and Iranians and Israelis and North Koreans, and Kim Jong-un, for example, I think was educated in a Swiss boarding school. So they're open to everybody as long as and they love making money. So that's sort of what Switzerland's about. So it was neutral, which is important. You could never have a Davos like in France or United States or Germany or Japan because they have their own policy on so many different things, and that would dominate the discussions. So the other thing is Davos is really hard to get to. So it's in a little mountain valley. It's a 2.5 hour drive from Zurich airport. And you can't just fly your jet in. It's a real, when you go, you have to go for some 3 or 4 days. You don't just go there for to make a speech and leave. So people are kind of stuck there. And so it's become a place where, you spend 3 or 4 days during Davos week. And it's a thing, and it's also in January, so it's the beginning of the year. It kind of sets the agenda. And Professor Schwab is very skillful. I mean, he has an unerring sense of not maybe what's down the road in 5 or 10 years, but what's down the road in a few months or next year. And so he kind of spots mega trends before others, I think. So, he has a good record on that. That said, I mean, the interesting thing about Davos is that almost invariably the consensus at Davos is almost always wrong for some reason. That there's going to be another 12 months of, high growth, or there's going to be a recession. It's almost invariably wrong.
Well, it's wrong sometimes. I don't have the exact figures in front of me. Yeah. The media jumps on it. Certain, fringes of media jump on it. Oh, look, they're wrong, they're wrong, they're wrong. And now they've come out, the World Economic Forum has come out this year with the theme of the Great Reset. Any thoughts on that theme?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very business focused. I mean, I think they're thinking about how, companies and economies can recover from the shock of the pandemic, of the COVID pandemic. I mean, that is, the central fact of life in every country and every economy on the planet. I think that's what it's about. So there'll be a lot of discussion about, what's changed for good, what hasn't changed, et cetera. And, I think it's a good subject. I mean, congratulations once again to Professor Schwab for picking the right theme, because I think that's on everybody's mind.
What are some of the biggest changes that you think that we're going to see in a post-COVID world? Some things are going to change, some things are not going to change. Any thoughts looking into the future?
Well, we're not out of COVID yet, which is, I think we're getting out of it, I suppose. But I mean, the mortality rate is certainly declining a lot, which is great. Look, I think for sure we're going to look anew at density. And, I'm an urbanist at heart. So I look at cities and how cities are organized economically, geographically, et cetera, technologically. So I think the paradigm of the sort of Western city has been for over a century and 125 years, has been a downtown business district, which is zoned as commercial real estate. And then people commuting into that in the morning and commuting out in the evening. I think that's going to be certainly already pre-COVID. There was a lot of discussion about changing that paradigm. And if you look, for example, at the financial district in New York, where there are a lot fewer people working there than there were in the past, it was starting to become much more mixed use. I mean, I have friends who live in apartments on Wall Street overlooking the stock exchange. That would have been unthinkable 20 years ago. So I think we're going to see more of that. I think there'll be a lot of pressure to change zoning in all cities around the world to accommodate this. I think we're in for a big crisis in commercial real estate. I see that as unavoidable. A lot of people are going to those who can, and particularly knowledge workers, will work at home 2 or 3 days a week, maybe go into the office once or twice a week for meetings or something like that. That's here to stay. I think that I don't see a retreat from that. I think a lot of us will go back to offices. I'm speaking from my office in downtown Los Angeles because I like coming here. It's quiet. I don't have distractions from my kids, wife, etc. But a lot of people would prefer to, stay at home and not spend an hour and a half in traffic, etc. So I think that will change, the configuration of houses and apartments in the future. I think we're going to they will be designed now with workspaces that are separate. That will really change that kind of configuration. It's going to be interesting. But I think there'll be a lot of discussion around density. I like density. I think density is good for cities. It's efficient. Density is good for sort of climate change conversation. think when you get kind of infinite cities and infinite exurbia, you waste a lot of energy, kind of one, moving around, two, heating your single family houses or cooling them or whatever. So I guess after we get, good vaccine and good therapeutics, people will get comfortable again with density. But I think the other thing, it's funny because if we look at NewCities Foundation, we look a lot at the future of housing. And whether it's, San Francisco or New York or Paris or Beijing, there's a constant in big cities around the world where housing has just become unaffordable, and especially unaffordable for middle classes. So, the silver lining, if you will, of the COVID pandemic has been to, certainly decrease rental prices in the inner city. I mean, they're dropping precipitously in San Francisco and New York. So I think that's good. I mean, it's kind of the market recalibrating demand. So
when I look at cities and I look at the current economic environment, I'm thankful that you brought up commercial real estate and, vast commercial mixed-use holdings. A lot of these owners are going to default. What's going to happen if we start seeing massive defaults around this? How is that going to change the cities? And on the backside of that, do you think that we'll ever see politicians step up to really take zoning laws head on and say, we don't need to have a gazillion parking spots. We can make this a park. We can make this a more walkable, livable environment. Do you think that this is kind of all coming together like the perfect storm where they're going to be forced into action? No more mañana?
Yeah, I think so. There's a lot in your statement, so I mean, I can unpack it a little bit. I think one unfortunate sort of short-term consequence of the pandemic is that people really don't feel safe at all in public transit. Mistakenly, by the way. I mean, I think if you wear a mask and you take some basic precautions, there's no reason why you can't take a metro in LA or a subway in New York. But there's a lot more use of cars because, you feel protected in your cocoon. And so I think that's a little bit counter-cyclical, I suppose you would call it. The tendency had been for fewer people to use cars. So I guess that will return to, I think, the whole idea of shared transport, whether it's public or private. I think that will come back because it's, economically, it just makes a lot of sense. I don't know. I'm not enough of an economist to predict, how steep the problems will be in commercial real estate or what the consequences will be of default. So that's not a question I really can answer.
That's fair. But when you talk about shared mobility coming back, you're right. Lyft recently reported rides were up 7.3% in August as compared to July. That's a positive statement. And it also says to me that consumers are getting comfortable to spend, and we're seeing data that they are spending more. They're getting comfortable to be around another individual because you have the driver and you're in the back seat and there's not the plexiglass like you see in some New York taxis. So it tells me that consumers are starting to get more and more comfortable. Are you seeing that in LA where these individuals around the city are getting more comfortable being out and about, or is it still a shelter-in-place mentality?
Yeah. Look, I think people everywhere are sick and tired of COVID. I mean, it's a natural. I mean, it's who the hell likes this? So I probably take chances that I shouldn't. I mean, I do try to wear a mask, etc., but I don't want to stay inside all day long either. I get cabin fever just like everybody else. And you see it here in LA on the beach. I mean, the beach is packed. People want to get out. On Lyft numbers, I think, they're coming from a low base. So you have to keep that in mind. So I think, tendentially they're going in the right direction, but, their business had almost dried up after all. The other thing that I think people don't need to keep in mind, and that's what gives me some optimism amid the ambient gloom that we have in our economies, is that one day President Trump will be right. This thing will be over. One day it'll disappear. It'll be a miracle. People are going to party like crazy after that. If you remember, after the Spanish influenza of 1918, 1919, beginning of the 1920s, we had the Roaring '20s. I mean, it was an amazing decade. I think there is a link. People were mass tens, hundreds of thousands of people dying, having to wear a mask at the time, etc. And once that was over, people partied like there was no tomorrow. And you had this decade-long run-up in the economy, which of course ended badly, as we all know, in 1929. But it was quite a decade apart from that, all over the world, by the way.
Consumers are going to party. They're going to spend money on experiences to get out of their house, and they're going to travel. And I'll give you a stat here that I think is very interesting. Airbnb saw more nights booked between May 17th and June 3rd, 2020 than the same period in 2019. We didn't have COVID at this point in 2019. This tells me that consumers we're fed up. We're getting out of our house. We want to go experience things. Do you think that this will continue to be a long-term rebound in travel where this will start to pick up, and the TSA data is also starting to pick up? It's consumers traveling, not business travelers. Will consumers continue to travel?
I'm not as optimistic as I think you are, Grayson. I mean, on those Airbnb numbers, I think I haven't examined them in detail, but I think we're one to examine them in detail. I think you'd find that a lot of it is not my getting an Airbnb room in London because I'm going there on a holiday. It's my using Airbnb to escape the city because of COVID and finding an Airbnb, a house in the country, in the isolated countryside somewhere. I think that's what it's about more than, it's actually leaving the city. I would love to crunch those numbers and see what they come up with. So I think on the contrary, I think it's still an utter catastrophe for the airlines. I don't see, it's a little, you do see some more flights coming out, going in and out of airports. It's true, but it's a catastrophe for, the Deltas, the Uniteds, the Americans. It's unclear how they're going to recover without massive aid. Same thing with, the Lufthansas and the Air Frances, et cetera. When will we get back to, people traveling again like I used to? I was on a plane every week going somewhere. I would go to Europe from Los Angeles without hardly thinking about it. When will I start doing that again? If ever, I don't know. And then you add on to that, in terms of business travel, so much of business can be transacted by Zoom calls. So why would I want to, have to schlep to London for a meeting when I can do it, perfectly well over the web? The other thing that's interesting, and I think will start to have an impact, probably not for a year or two, but that is, the whole world of metaverses and virtual reality. And I think if right now we have business meetings the way we're doing now on the internet, on the web, in the future, I think we'll be putting on some kind of headset. We will enter some kind of three-dimensional metaverse, and the John Rossant avatar will be talking in a very realistic way with the Grayson Brulte avatar. And that's doable now. I think the technology has to improve, but that's going to be just a quantum change in how we meet each other, how we do business together, how we travel, all sorts of things. But that's in the future, a few years, but it's coming for sure.
If that reality happens, how does that impact cities? Do we people to stay in the suburbs and they have this little virtual thing that they can zoom in, and you're in a city and I'm in a suburban area and we can just meet together? Does that further spread the divide?
I guess so. I don't think it has anything to do with sort of suburbs versus downtown. I think it's more you're putting on your Oculus or whatever headset it is, and you're in your living room, but you're walking down the street in Paris. And that's what's going to happen. And having a conversation with a Parisian or whatever. I think we probably will experience travel virtually to some extent in the future. It's 0% now, but in 5 years, it may be 5% or something. It'll start to be felt for sure. The technology is too compelling.
I'm old school. I like a physical newspaper. I like to go places. I like to read hardback books. So I'm not sold on the virtual travel yet, because I think that coming out of this pandemic, you're going to see a people are in a Zoom coma. They're over Zoom. They don't want to use the video chat anymore. They want to go out and see people. And at some point in the near future, you'll get back on a plane and you'll go to Europe. I'm going to get back on a plane and I'm going to go to Europe and other places around the world to see things and experience things and to experience cultures. Because no matter how great digital's getting and virtual's getting, there's nothing like walking around Paris or getting lost in Venice and experiencing new cultures that you can't do digitally. And it's something that you're never going to be able to replace.
Yes, I think, but you will get pretty close. I mean, much, much closer than now. And so I find it the idea of putting on a headset and walking down a canal in Venice in a three-dimensional way, that's pretty interesting. And, it's not quite the same thing, but it's something new and different and very approximate to what the reality is. So it can go in some interesting ways. Yeah.
I mean, it'd be cool. You do it once or you do it twice, or for if you're a student at a school to learn to help better curriculum. So I get the education aspect of it. I'm not sold on the virtual tourism, but I want to pivot here for a little bit. You serve as an advisor to NEOM in Saudi Arabia. It's a living laboratory and a hub for innovation. Is this kind of the stuff that you're working to develop over there? Or can you kind of share some insight? Because this city, from all the stuff I've read, that they just want to completely reimagine a city around innovation from the ground up.
Yeah, that's definitely the idea. I mean, this is a very, very, very big project, which is essentially creating a 21st century city with 21st century technology from the ground up. It's in the northwest corner of Saudi Arabia, which is up until now completely undeveloped. It's along the Red Sea, so you have miles and miles of coastline that are completely pristine and wonderful coral reefs and mountains and ruins. And it's closer to Israel and Egypt and the Mediterranean than the rest of the country. It's sort of more part of the Mediterranean world than the Gulf, for example. So it's actually quite close to Europe. It's got a more temperate climate than the rest of the country. And it's about the size of Belgium or Israel. I mean, it's a very, very large territory. So only about 2% of it will actually be urbanized. The idea, I think, was to build a city from the ground up that takes into account, I think, two of the big sort of meta trends of the modern world. One is the mobility revolution, which is decarbonized transportation, autonomous mobility, so that certainly electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. So just mobility that doesn't emit pollution, let's say. So if you think of your 20th century city model, it's essentially modeled after LA, which with the post-war freeways. So you take Dubai, for example, it's like a mini LA. It's got freeways everywhere and overpasses, and it's built around the motor car. So NEOM imagines a city that doesn't have to be built around the motor car. In fact, there won't be really a place in NEOM for the individually owned motor car. The second meta trend that is taken into account in NEOM is the energy transition towards away from hydrocarbon and fossil fuels to renewable energy. So can't go into too much detail, but NEOM will almost entirely be based on renewable energy, which is, coming from the world's largest oil exporter is quite a statement about the future, I think. And the other thing is that it's being set up with its own legal system. It's almost as if it were a separate country. I think people don't quite realize that, actually. So you can do things in NEOM that you might not be able to do, for example, in the rest of Saudi Arabia.
Is this part of the mission with the building on the Davos in the desert to make Saudi Arabia a home to innovation?
Yeah. I mean, look, you have a country that is almost solely dependent on exporting oil. They know better than anybody that that's a finite resource. People don't want the bad things about hydrocarbons, the pollution, they experience climate change as much as we do. So I think, and we are becoming more and more efficient in how we use energy. So I think the underlying demand for oil is simply going to evaporate in the future. Whether it's in 5 years or 20 years or 40 years, I don't know. But it's going to happen. So I think this is a way of preparing for that. At the same time, they have a population that is incredibly young. I mean, the average age in Saudi Arabia is around 19 or 20. So it's really, really skewed towards youth. And these kids will need to find jobs, and they will not be in oil refineries in the future. Those jobs won't exist. They'll be in new kinds of industries, in robotics and coding, things like that. So that's part of the impetus behind NEOM, I think.
Will all the mobility and the shared vehicles, will those all just be pure EVs?
Yeah, I think so. And, I think fuel cells will be important part of the mix in NEOM because hydrogen production, green hydrogen production is going to be very important there. They have a lot of solar, very good solar, a lot of wind along the Red Sea. So you have the two elements that make for abundant green hydrogen. So that's an interesting fuel. It's certainly the fuel of the future, in my view.
You have a really great take on the future. So you've started your career working in Paris, then you're advising on the NEOM project, which is building the city of the future. And then you've put all this fancy stuff of Davos and dealing with individuals that are difficult to deal with at times. And then 2016 rolls around. You decide to launch the Commotion brand. Was that taking the best of what's happening at NEOM, the best of what's happening at Davos, the best of what you saw in Paris, and putting it all together in one event in LA? Was how you kind of started that?
Not really. I wouldn't put it quite like that. At NewCities Foundation, we're obviously focused on cities. And so when you look at cities, you have to look at the mobility and transportation piece. And you're going back around 7 or 8 years ago, actually Google approached us because they were beginning to ramp up very large investments in R&D in driverless mobility and in autonomous mobility through UberX at the time, the kind of moonshot program at Google. And they wanted to understand how driverless autonomous mobility would fit into an urban context. So they knocked at the door of NewCities Foundation, which was fine. And I remember I was living in New York at the time, and the same week that I think we signed the membership papers with Google, I think 2 or 3 people approached me independently of each other and said, "Have you heard about this amazing app that this startup in San Francisco is launching called Hubert or Uber or Ubert?" People didn't understand what it was. And I think by the end of the week, we realized this was going to be big, that this was very fundamental disruption in mobility and transportation, that all cities around the world would be ultimately impacted one way or the other. And so we decided as an institution that is focused on cities, we had to really understand this and get ahead of it. And so we said, why don't we, start a conference or a gathering and bring in like the 150 smartest people who think about the future of mobility. And so Google actually loved that idea. And we had our first gathering about 8 years ago in Mountain View at Googleplex. It was called Cities on the Move, the Future of Urban Mobility. And we did that for 2 or 3 years, and we had convenings in London and Tokyo. And we launched a research program at our foundation on connected mobility. And then we started looking more and more closely at Los Angeles. It's the ultimate car city. It's the largest urban car market. And Mayor Garcetti and his team had just published at the time something called the Mobility 2035 Plan, which is a kind of blueprint for virtually a post-car Los Angeles. I thought, wow, that's not the Los Angeles I used to know. And I came out here and I realized this, if LA could change, any city in the world could change. And I thought, why don't we bring this itinerant conference on future mobility, bring it to LA and build it out in a kind of South by Southwest fashion? And that led to the launch of Commotion 4 years ago. And it's been a big success. And, we're very much looking forward to the 4th edition, which unfortunately will be virtual, but still very, very interesting, very rich program, November 17th through 19th. So I'm very much looking forward to that.
It's just coming up. So what were some of the highlights over the years that you can share with the listeners about Commotion? What have been some of the big breakthroughs that have happened there?
Oh, God, there's so many. I don't know where to start, but I think, we've had a big focus on electric mobility, for example. And I think more than ever, Los Angeles and the Los Angeles region, Southern California, from, let's say, Santa Barbara to San Diego, is emerging as the beating heart of electric mobility. I mean, you have a critical mass of companies now that are based here, whether it's Rivian, which down in Orange County, which has a great electric pickup truck and electric SUV that's coming on the market next year. Canoe, Fisker. This is the birthplace of electric micromobility, et cetera, with Bird, which was birthed in Santa Monica. So I think, LA is so dynamic for that. It really is in some ways, the heart of the mobility revolution. So, I remember the first year we had the Minister of Transportation of Dubai came with a kind of delegation of about 20 people. And I think he announced at the first edition of Commotion, he announced a $10 million prize for autonomous mobility, which I think was just awarded about a year ago. And he talked about, that they were starting electric autonomous air taxis. And it was only 4 years ago, but people were not talking at all about urban air mobility. And certainly it's now becoming a thing. And so every year, the urban air mobility conversation has become more important. And we have a whole bunch of panels and workshops on it in mid-November. There again, I think LA will emerge and is emerging as, the beating heart of that sector, partially because it's a great way of getting around this vast spread out city. And, we have dozens of municipal airports. And indeed, Uber is going to roll out commercial electric air taxis in 2023 in Los Angeles. It's going to be one of the first markets. So there are things like that. I think the whole micromobility thing we've been covering very well, and a lot of the players that you know about, whether it's sort of Lime or Bird, et cetera, started out at Commotion, and you could kind of take it out for a ride, et cetera. So we're going to see more and more of incredible innovation.
When you look at urban air mobility, Mark Moore and the team at Uber Elevate have done an incredible job based on his NASA Puffin paper around safety and redundancy.
Yeah.
But the little thing that a lot of folks don't talk about, and when you talk to Mark about it, he gets very proud. They figure out how to limit the noise. How are we going to get politicians to understand that Uber's taking this noise pollution problem very seriously? So when we start having Uber eVTOLs running all around Los Angeles, how are they going to embrace that this is not going to create a noise pollution? Because we've all been in LA, and I used to live in the region when the helicopter, the police chase goes by, and that helicopter's loud. And there's a lot of negative feedback from neighbors and businesses and constituents. How are we going to get politicians on board to say, okay, urban air mobility is a great fit for Los Angeles just because of the dense spread?
I don't think noise is going to be the big challenge, actually. I think the big challenge is going to be actually a more complicated one. And that is for the first few years, because costs will still be very, very high to launch commercially viable urban air mobility services. You're going to have to charge quite a lot, which means that to a large extent, maybe it's not the 1%, it's the 5% who are going to use it. It's someone who lives in Bel Air and has to get to LAX in 5 minutes. And that'll cost $150. But that's not for the man or woman in the street, so to speak. And so I think that, we live in an increasingly anti-elitist age. So I think that's going to be a challenge. And I don't know if people are there'll be so much pressure on politicians to change regulations, et cetera, to accommodate that small section of the population. I think that's going to be a bigger challenge. I think the way around that is to start making the use case for urban air mobility. I'm a big believer in this. I think this is a wonderful thing, and I can't wait to have cities where you have jets and mobiles everywhere. I love that idea, frankly. But I think you're going to have to find use cases, for example, delivering emergency medical services, getting first responders to someone who's had a stroke or a heart attack. And you can do that in an eVTOL in 5 minutes. And the delta between that 5 minutes and, let's say, 45 minutes or an hour until an ambulance comes can mean life or death. So I think people like that idea. So then I think there's the whole logistics thing, which is starting to happen really quickly. I mean, Amazon recently got approval from the FAA to test out drone deliveries of packages in American cities. Zipline, which is a very, very innovative company based in the Bay Area, which delivers medicine in Africa, rural Africa, via drones, because there's not really a viable road system often, is now starting package deliveries from Walmart, testing them out here in the United States. So I think that's a sector that's going to grow really quickly. Yeah, it's extremely exciting, I think.
It's definitely exciting, and Walmart's becoming interesting. They're out innovating everybody, and they're just this quiet little steady as she goes. And as it could to go back to, you said the 5% they're going to take urban air mobility. Don't forget that's also the largest donor base that puts the politicians in office. So you're going to have some more subway-like political battles that LA's having, but. So LA is an interesting place with a lot of mobility challenges, and one of the biggest logistical challenges in the world is coming to LA in 2028 with the Summer Olympics. What new forms of mobility are we going to see LA to move individuals around from UCLA to downtown to Long Beach and all the various Olympic sites?
Well, look, first of all, LA Metro by 2028 will have put in a whole bunch of new lines and new services. So first and foremost, it's going to be the light rail, the metro system in Los Angeles, which hadn't really existed a few years ago. It does exist. It's a thing now. And certainly we had the Measure M bill, which raises around $120 billion for mobility infrastructure, transportation infrastructure in the Los Angeles region. So that's important. So I think it'll be light rail. Without a doubt, there are going to be a lot of autonomous services, so autonomous shuttles going from venue to venue. That will certainly be here by 2028. I have no doubt about that. I think you're going to have, there's been a huge expansion in electric bikes, for God's sake. So for relatively short distances, I think we're going to see a lot of that. I hope that Los Angeles will continue to build out protected bike lanes. I think it is just a great form of mobility, particularly for this city. I don't see, by 2028, I don't see things like, Hyperloop at scale or anything like that. Surely we'll have certain kinds of air shuttles, electric air shuttles going around the city by that time. So it will be a pretty changed LA by 2028, and for the better, I think, with more mobility options. I think the whole key is that you have options, and that it becomes much more truly multimodal. I think that's the key to success, where you can go somewhere via, with an electric bike, with a scooter, with shared mobility via Uber or Lyft or something like that. Ultimately, an electric air taxi, public metro, etc. So you'll have a much richer offer than now.
While your vision's bright, makes a lot of sense, can Sacramento get out of the way from a regulatory perspective? Because a lot of this stuff is getting stopped in Sacramento because of the undue regulations that the state of California puts on the mobility industry.
Yeah, we could talk for hours about that. and look, I think that in many cases, regulation doesn't have to be negative. Regulation is important. You certainly want regulation in third dimensional mobility in the airspace. You don't want, eVTOLs crashing into one another and, landing anywhere, et cetera. That's going to be very, very highly regulated, as it should be. Yeah, I think it's tough, California. It is tough. It's not for its being a state that, were it independent, would be the fifth or sixth largest economy, and you have powerhouses like the Googles, et cetera. It is not the most business-friendly state by a long shot. And sometimes I think, they just put shackles on business in a crazy way. So I hope that can change. I'm not sure it will.
I agree with you. I'll sum it up this way as we look to wrap up. It's sad because California is the land of opportunity, and there is an incredible opportunity sitting in front of the state if the politicians, regulators can get out of their way and let the free market work and allow companies to innovate and provide services around all sorts of mobility for no matter what part of the state you're living in. If you're in Bakersfield or you're in downtown LA, you should have the ability to access a mobility that makes sense for you and for your family. And John, and as we look to wrap up this insightful conversation, what would you like our listeners to take away for your vision for the future of mobility?
Well, I think one thing is that I deeply believe that we are not even in the middle, but on the cusp, at the beginning of a profound revolution in how people and goods move about cities. And it's a true revolution. So I think that it's a big secular shift in how we do things. So a lot of people ask me about the impact of COVID. I mean, I think it will be transitory to an extent because, it may slow down a little bit like shared mobility, but this revolution is a really profound one. I mean, and it will continue. And we are not even seeing the big impacts yet. They're still to come. When you have more and more electric, you have hydrogen fuel powering the trucking industry, when you have sort of urban air mobility, it's going to be very, very different in our cities. And you can begin to reimagine what streets are, really. And the streets now, and for the last 150 years, have been built to accommodate individually owned motor cars. That will no longer be the case in coming years. So that's a big, big shift. I mean, that's as fundamental as the Romans leaving us the grid system for cities to accommodate their chariots back in 2,000 years ago. And that in some ways, European cities were modeled on that model. So I think, we're in for something completely new and different. So it's a really exciting time to be alive, without a doubt. So I'm optimistic, I must say.
Optimistic is awesome, and optimistic is good. And as we've heard on this conversation, culture will play a large part in the future of mobility. And John, thank you for sharing your global perspective on mobility, smart cities, the urban environment. And we wish you nothing but the best of luck with the virtual Commotion 2020. And we cannot wait to see you in person in 2021 for the next Commotion, because I've been hearing a little rumor that you got something very special planned.
More on that later.
Awesome.
Grayson, great talking to you, man.
Thank you so much.
As usual. Take care.
The future's bright, the future's autonomous, and in the future, we will have multimodal transportation options.
That's it.
Thank you for listening to the Road to Autonomy podcast. If you've enjoyed listening, please rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Want to get in touch? Follow us on Twitter at Road to Autonomy or email podcast@brulteco.com. The Road to Autonomy is produced by Brulte & Company. The views and opinions expressed on the Road to Autonomy podcast do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of Brulte & Company. The content discussed on this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be taken as legal, tax, investment, or business advice.